He answered, there is no problem really. They have only too little geography, far too little geography, and far too long history. Now, this is very true, because on the very little geography that the Jewish people always had, there were always disputes and quarrels. On the very long history that the Jewish people had, they always have been also quarrels and disagreements. I would like to note the fact that when President Obama had been visiting recently in Jerusalem, the first place that he was taken to visit was the Shrine of the Book. That's the place where some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are being presented to the public. Why did the government of Israel had chosen to take President Obama as the first place to the Shrine of the Book to see scrolls such as the scroll of Isaiah or the scroll of Sons of Light against Sons of Darkness and other beautiful scrolls there? Because, as a matter of fact, one can say, I quote, because the scrolls are testimony to the antiquity of Jewish roots in the land west of the Jordan. Now, there is no more antique evidence to the presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel in the first millennium before the Common Era, a written evidence, more ancient one than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, everybody heard about them, very few people had read them, but the one interesting thing about them is the following. When they were found out between 1947 to 1956, in a very troublesome decade of the history of the Jewish people, right after the Holocaust, right after Independence War, before the Sinai War, when they were found out, they were designated by three geographical names. They were called the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were called Scrolls of the Judean Desert, they were called Qumran Scrolls. Those are all synonyms, and correct synonyms. They were found, in fact, in the Qumran caves along the west side of the Dead Sea. However, when one is using those geographical designations, one is free from answering the basic questions. Who wrote them? When had they been written? Why they were being written? Why they have been lost in oblivion for more than 2,000 years? How did it happen? Is it only accidental? Because, as I said, when you use the geographical designation, you miss the issue. They certainly were found in a certain place, no doubt about that. But why they were found there? Who had written them? What had made such a huge library? There are between 900 to 1,000 fragments of parchment, with one common denominator, which is usually not taken to sufficient attention. All 1,000 fragments, some of them are long, some of them are little shreds, all 1,000 fragments of parchment, with no exception, all of them are sacred writings. Among the 1,000 fragments that we have found, there is not a single private correspondence, there is no bill, there is no commercial document, there is no ketubah, there is no any private document. All of them are sacred writings. Now, what do I mean by sacred writings? They are based on the biblical world. They take the freedom to expand the biblical world. However, the language is biblical Hebrew, basically, Aramaic, biblical Aramaic, a little bit in Greek, but most of the scrolls are written in biblical Hebrew. Now, why so many scrolls written in biblical Hebrew, and a few words which are not known to us, but basically anyone who reads biblical Hebrew can read the scrolls with not too great an effort. But why those scrolls were kept in oblivion? Why they were forgotten? Why they were found accidentally between 1947 to 1956? I was wondering about this question, and I should start my talk by saying that I'm deeply endowed and deeply grateful to the 120 scholars who had worked universally together in order to bring to print the 1,000 pieces of parchment. That was a very hard work, sorting it out, transcribing it, translating it, trying to understand what is that we transcribe and translate and understand. Because when you are looking on a text that you know, it's not too much of a trouble. But when you look on text that you don't know, there is a trouble. How do you edit a text that you have never seen before? What would be the context? Now, the question that I was interested in was the following. There is a huge library. No writers are designated in the general scholarships other than in a general way it had been associated with the Essenes. I asked a librarian question. Let's say that those were books, and by now we have 40 volumes of the Oxford series of the, we call it DJD, Discoveries of the Judean Desert. Most of them have come to print only in the 90s and in the first decade of the present century. When you have those numerous textual evidence in 40 volumes, they are accessible for everyone. Now everyone can read them. You don't need to be an Aramaic scholar or biblical scholar or ancient Hebrew scholar. Everyone can read the transcribed text. When we see the whole entire library, and this is an innovation only really of the last decade and a half, that the whole library is available for everyone who wishes to read. I asked a question of a librarian. How would I divide it? What would be the general division, very general, not, if you have 1,000 texts, you cannot divide it to 1,000. You ask yourself, what are the common denominators of groups of text? How would I divide it in a very general way? I suggest to divide it according to the content of the scrolls, which makes sense, not according to presuppositions who had written them, but according to the simple librarian question. How would I identify them? How would I describe them? To which shelf should I put them? I suggest to divide them to 5 major shelves. Now, each one of those shelves could have under divisions, but in general, when we ask what do we have when we talk about those 1,000 pieces of parchment, some of them are in length of a Torah scroll, some of them are very tiny, less than 1 page, but we do have about 1,000 different pieces of parchment. How should we group them? Now, I'll start from the obvious and known to the unknown. I would suggest to divide them to 5 groups. The first group is the biblical library. Now, we were fortunate enough to find testimonies on parchment, of the whole entire biblical library. Whenever I say Bible or biblical, I mean only the Old Testament. The 24 books in the Old Testament, we found 23 of them among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book of Esther is not found, and probably for a good reason, and I'll discuss it later. However, all other 23rd book out of 24 books of the Bible are there. Not exactly always with the same tradition, with the same textual tradition that we are acquainted with. There are some slight differences. Some books are more variegated than the canonical biblical tradition. However, if we look on that in general, we can say that the people who put the scrolls in the caves had access to the whole entire biblical library. And remember, the Bible was written along a millennium before the Common Era, but had been canonized in a final version only after the destruction of the temple. The Bible was written on scrolls, not as one book, but on scroll. The scroll of Jeremiah, the scroll of Isaiah, the scroll of Genesis. We found remnants of all the books of the Bible with the exception of the scroll of Esther. Why is that? The scroll of Esther does not have the name of God in it. That's a good idea. That's a good reason not to include it. Because all other biblical books have direct or indirect reference to the divine word or to the divine authority or to the divine revelation. The book of Esther does not. In a library that all what it contains could be defined as sacred writings, a book without a divine reference is not a sacred writing, thus would not be included. I would skip very closely on the biblical part, because you're familiar with the biblical part. I'll say that anyone who is doing any work on any single biblical book among the 24 books of the Old Testament would do very wisely to consult the Qumran edition of the Bible of the Scrolls, because it has beautiful little and big differences which shed fantastic light. More than that, after we said that about 1/5 of the collection is biblical books which offer very interesting textual renditions, very interesting textual traditions which were not known to us before the scrolls were found. Like, for instance, we have the scroll of Isaiah, close enough to the biblical tradition. But we have another scroll of Isaiah which have meaningful differences. Now, what is the meaning of those meaningful differences? It means that different communities had different recensions of the Bible. There was not only one canonical scroll of Isaiah, there were more than one recension. This is very interesting to us. We didn't know it. We know, of course, about the Septuaginta. We know about the Samaritan version. But we didn't know that there were other versions in Hebrew which are not exactly as the biblical tradition. Now, put the biblical part aside, because this is the known one and that's the easiest one. I would like to go to a next group which is partially known. It is called para-biblical writings. We know about that in a vague way. We were familiar with collections known as pseudepigrapha or apocrypha, in which books such as First Enoch or Jubilees or Testament of the 12 Tribes were transmitted in various lingual traditions from antiquity to modernity. We didn't know their Hebrew origin. We never had access to the Hebrew origin of the Book of Jubilees, to the Aramaic origin of the Book of Enoch. We were fascinated to find the origins of the pseudo-epigraphic literature in Hebrew and Aramaic among the Dead Sea Scrolls. We didn't know about their existence. We suspected that once upon a time there was such a book, but we didn't have access to the origin. Now, that is easy to understand because the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, the Testaments of the 12 Tribes were known to us before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. However, here comes a whole other group of books which was utterly unknown to us. We call it, as I said, para-biblical, and it is based on the following principle. You may take any figure from the Pentateuch and tell about him an elaborated story. Let's say we're all familiar with Enoch from Noah, or from Enoch, or from Levi, from the Pentateuch. The scrolls are telling us there is a book of Enoch, there is a book of Noah, there is a testament of Levi, there is a testament of his son Kehat, there is a testament of his grandson Amram. We didn't know about the existence of such literature until the scrolls were found. We had been granted with the unbelievable innovation that before the Common Era, and all the scrolls, or the absolute majority of the scrolls, have been written in the 2nd century and the 1st century before the Common Era, very few on the first few decades of the 1st century of the Common Era, but the greatest number of scrolls have been written in the last 2 centuries before the Common Era. And as I said, copies of ancient books of the Bible have been retrieved there as well. Now, about this second group that I was talking about, the para-biblical, we learned that there was a freedom of creativity, utterly unknown to us. Now, this is not a midrash, this is not an exegesis, this is not homily, this is not halacha, this is not anything of the kind that we had known before. This is something new. It is the freedom to retell the biblical history. We were not familiar with the existence of such freedom before the Bible, before the scrolls had been found. The third group, which is of great interest, the third group is called the Mystical Liturgical Library. We didn't know about its existence, we didn't have a clue. Books such as Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, which are beautiful, beautiful angelic Hebrew. Please note the angels above us reading books. They're doing exactly what the angels are described in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're always reading, teaching, chanting, officiating in a heavenly sanctuary. However, this part of the library, mystical liturgical work, with names like Hodayot or Thanksgiving, with names like blessings, with names like the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, were utterly unknown to us. And they were not found in one copy. They were found in many copies. There are like 13 copies of the songs of the Sabbath liturgy. There are quite a few copies of the Thanksgiving scroll. There are numerous copies of the Psalm scrolls, which include much more psalms than those which are known to us. The 150 psalms that we know from the Bible are, of course, of great importance. But there are quite a few more which were not known to us in this beautiful liturgic shelf of the library. Now, I called it mystical liturgical. What does it mean, mystical? That's a library or that's a literature of crossing borders. Humans and angels are working together, are singing together, are officiating together. This is not something we had been informed about in the biblical library as came to us through tradition. Angels are vital in this library. Now they would say sentence such as, the holy angels are in their council, or the holy angels are in their midst. They were living, some of those who had written those traditions, with angels in their consciousness for very particular reason, which I would discuss a little later. However, when we describe the various shelves of the library, the first one is the biblical one, the second one is the para-biblical one, the third one is the mystical liturgical ones, which has angelic liturgy. The fourth one is polemical library that we didn't know anything about. We didn't know the Jews had written books such as The War of Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, that they had written books such as Pesharim, which means commentaries, where they are talking on people of evil against people of righteousness, where they're describing a preacher who is a priest, a high priest preacher, who is called Moreh Tzedek or Kohen Tzedek, teacher of righteousness and priest of righteousness, who is working against preacher of evil and priest of evil. We didn't know any historical circumstances that justified such names. It was complete surprise. We didn't know that such a literature exists. And there is, as I said, the scroll of the war between Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness as an example of this polemical library, or the scrolls which are known as Psharim, commentaries, which are reinterpreting the prophetic visions for the future as are happening in the times of the people who are writing the scrolls. There are numerous other polemical documents. However, the point is that it was utterly unknown to us. We didn't know that there is a huge literature of arguments, the word polemic, it comes from the Greek word polemos, which is war. This is a warlike literature, war aggressive literature, where one group is fighting vehemently against another group. We didn't have any historical knowledge on such a situation. We have a book called Apocryphon of Ezekiel. It is said there in Hebrew, על כן התקרא ישראל על התורה ועל הברית. Thus the people of Israel have been torn, have been shred on the covenant and on the law. We didn't know about it. There is not a single historical clue telling us before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found that there was a horrible reef, that there was a rapture, that there was a war. We didn't know about it. So it just teaches us, we can learn from that history is ocean of oblivion with islands of knowledge. We had found a new, not only island, we had found a new continent which was utterly unknown to us. Before that, we had the book of Maccabees, not in the Hebrew canon, in the Greek canon. We had some of pseudo-epigraphical books in Greek and Latin and Greece. We had the book of Ben Sira, a very interesting book in Hebrew and Greek. However, we didn't know anything of all what I've been talking about from a literature that had been written in the two last centuries before the Common Era. Now the fifth part, which is of great interest, it is called, we can call it a sectarian literature, although I reserve I use this word with reservation, because when you say sectarian, you suggest that there is a center somewhere that one is dissecting from. However, when one is looking on 175 BCE, or 110 BCE, or 90 BCE, where is the center of the Jewish people exactly? Who is the formal leader of the Jewish people in the 2nd century BCE? Is there a consensus of such historical leadership? No, there isn't. There has been no consensus on the leadership of the Jewish people in the 2nd century BCE, in the 1st century BCE. It had been a time of turmoil. It has been a time of considerable historical changes. I would say that in two sentences for the sake of brevity. In 175 before the Common Era, King Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucian king, had conquered the land of Israel and had imposed his idea of what was called bureaucratical order. He wanted to nominate his people in the temple, because the temple was a place where sacrifices were offered for the sake of the king, not the Jewish king, for the sake of the ruler, according to the perception of Antiochus. He wanted to collect taxes in relation to ceremonial things in the temple. He wanted to organize the kingdom according to one calendar, a lunar calendar of the Greek Empire. That was their calendar for years and years. When he approached the Jerusalem temple and he had ordered the officiating priest, Jason III, to officiate according to a new lunar calendar, the high priest had refused, and he said, "We will do everything you want, but we cannot officiate the temple according to a lunar calendar, because we have a different system." The book of Daniel, chapter 7, is telling us in an elusive way, the revolution that had occurred in the days of a king that wanted to change laws and times, to change calendars and customs of days of gone by. However, to make a long story short, before King Antiochus Epiphanes, that's Antiochus IV, had conquered Jerusalem and had imposed a new lunar calendar, for 1,000 years, nearly 1,000 years, there had been another system, not the Seleucian system. It was the temple in Jerusalem. Now, we don't know much about it, more than it's written in the biblical historiography. We know about the temple from the time of David, we know about the temple from the book of Kings, from the book of Chronicles. We have quite a lot of tradition about the temple, but we don't know quite a few details. The Dead Sea Scrolls telling us new things about the temple. They're telling us that the temple was arranged the temple worship was arranged according to a solar calendar. I don't wish to pass a verdict whether this is a historical truism from the days of David or whether this is a projection from the time of the people who had written these scrolls. I don't know. I would just say that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have numerous documents who are talking about solar calendar, of pre-calculated calendar emerging, commencing in the spring. While the Jewish calendar, known to all of you who are following the Jewish calendar, is starting in the autumn. The current Jewish calendar is starting in the autumn, in the month of Tishrei, while the biblical calendar states explicitly that the calendar starts in the spring. In the book of Exodus 12, we're told that the calendar is commencing in the month of the spring, the first month of the year, where the year is starting as a divine declaration of the beginning of freedom, of the epoch of freedom. It is given up in the time where the story of the departure from Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, towards the way to become a free nation. Then there is a calendar introduced, and it is said, this month, the month of the spring, is the head of the year, or the first of the month. You would always start to count from the first month. Now, the Jews of today are counting according to a different calendar, starting in the month of the autumn, in the seventh month. We start the year by a holiday called Rosh Hashanah. There is no such holiday in the Bible. In the Bible, the holiday, the first of the seventh month, is called the Day of the Memorial of the Trumpets. Nothing to do with the head of the year. However, the point that I would like to make is the following. The people who had written the scrolls, and it was not one person and it was not one group. Those were many hands and those were many people and many books. However, when one is looking on the following question, after we know that there are 5 kinds of shelves, the biblical, the para-biblical, the mystical liturgical, the polemical, and the sectarian one. The sectarian one is those that define themselves as members of the covenant against others who are departing from the covenant. When we have those 5 shelves of different literature, we ask ourselves, is there any common denominator to all those various shelves? Is there one topic which is recurrent in the very different type of literatures which have been written by different hands and in different times? The answer is yes. There are a number of issues which are recurrent in different literary genres, by different authors, written in different periods. And the one which is most striking is the presence of a solar calendar. A calendar which the writers ascribe to a mythical ancient past. The people who had authored the book of First Enoch, it's called the Ethiopian Enoch because it was first known to us in the language of Giz, which is an Ethiopian language, Semitic Ethiopian language. In the book of Enoch, chapter 72-82, is telling us in great detail on the calendar of 364 days. In the book of Psalms that had been found in Qumran, entirely different genre, Psalms. In the extra Psalms, those which are not known to us in the Bible, in the Psalm scrolls which is presented in the shrine of the book, in column 27 we are told that David, king of Israel, the one who had been described as wise and as poetically gifted and as a prophet according to this scroll, had authored 364 daily songs for each day of the year. He further had authored 52 sacred songs for every one of the Sabbaths of the years. He further authored 18 special songs for the holidays of the year. Now, in entirely different kind of genre, let's say the book of Jubilees, which is para-biblical because it is retelling the book of Genesis. In the book of Jubilees, we are told that Noah had stayed in the ark 364 days, which are divided equally to 4 seasons of 91 days, commencing in the spring. The same is true for the scroll of priestly watches, which is worked on a calendar of 364 days. The same is true to a letter called Miktzat Maaseh Torah, a few observations on the acts of the Torah. The scroll is commencing with a calendar, telling us that the first week of the year starts in the spring, and there are 52 weeks in every year, and in each week a different priestly scroll is serving according to a calendar of 364 days. Now, the centrality of the solar calendar could not be exaggerated in the library of Qumran. As I said, in various different genres, in